Give a balanced view, some of it using material from History Colorado's current exhibit on the Sand Creek Massacre. How many people have been to History Colorado and seen that exhibit? Okay, about 10 of you. It's a very sobering and uncomfortable presentation from the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes' point of view, but one that we should all know and learn from. Today I'm going to divide my talk into, well, this is from the exhibit at History Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre, the betrayal that changed Cheyenne and Arapaho people forever. Today I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. The first is the historical background to Sand Creek. Secondly, I will discuss the actual attack on November 29th, 1864. And lastly, I'll talk about the aftermath and how, as History Colorado's exhibit says, it changed the Arapaho and Cheyenne people forever. Those of you who have read any of my books know that I like to do a lot of backstory, because I don't think you can understand, the event that the book is about until you understand what preceded it. So part of my talk today is going to be about the historical background. Before the arrival of the white man from Europe in the 1400s, over 1,000 native tribes resided in what we today call America, or the United States. And they had been there anywhere from 25 to 30,000 years. Today, that number of tribes is down to about 574 nationally recognized American Indian tribes. Most scholars place the pre-Columbian population in North America at between 12 million and 18 million, but no one knows for sure. By 1700, the native population had been decimated by diseases carried from Europe, and they may have numbered only about 2 million then. The natives were spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific and north into what is now Canada and south into what is now Mexico. They inhabited forests and deserts, mountains and swamps. Some tribes had permanent settlements and cultivated the land and grew crops such as corn or maize and raised animals, while others were nomadic and followed the buffalo herds, relying on their hunting and fishing skills to provide food for their families. Not all tribes were peaceful. Many fought vicious battles with their neighbors. There was no common language and no overall government. When the whites arrived, uninvited, on the continent and the first colonies were established, it was a shock to the natives' collective systems. Some tribes resisted the invaders, while others tried to make peace with them. Spanish conquistadors arrived on the continent in the 14 and 1500s and explored much of what we now call the Southwest, primarily looking for gold. In the guise of trying to be fair with the natives, the Europeans drew up treaties that promised certain benefits in exchange for the natives giving up what the whites wanted most, the land. We probably all heard that in 1626, so the story goes, indigenous inhabitants sold off the entire island of Manhattan to Dutch settlers for a tiny sum, just $24 worth of beads and trinkets, or for 60 guilders, the Dutch currency at the time, the equivalent of more than $1,000 today. It turns out that this is probably a myth. As more and more Europeans crossed the Atlantic and gobbled up more and more native land, many of the indigenous tribes were pushed ever westward. Some chose to stand and fight against the intruders, such as the Jamestown Massacre of 1622. We'll jump ahead a century now to the French and Indian War, the North American phase of the larger 7 Years' War between Britain and France. It began after a series of incidents in the upper Ohio River Valley, which the French and British governments both claimed as their territory. It ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The war provided Great Britain enormous territorial gains in North America, but disputes over subsequent frontier policy and paying the war's expenses led to colonial discontent and ultimately to the American Revolution. In the early 1800s, the U.S. government authorized explorations into the West. In 1804, Thomas Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their historic journey to the Pacific Northwest. Zebulon Pike's expedition west in 1806 took him into what is now Colorado. Additional expeditions followed over the next few decades, bringing more and more whites into what had been the natives' exclusive territory. In 1833, a trading post known as Bent's Fort was established on the Arkansas River by the Bent brothers and their friend and business partner, Saran St. Vrain. How many of you have visited Bent's Fort? Okay, almost everybody in the room. It's beautiful reconstruction of that structure. Here's a early map showing its location. It was right in the lower left-hand corner, right on the Santa Fe Trail, the main highway between northern Mexico, Santa Fe, and Independence, Missouri. It was patronized by both whites and natives. It was an important part of the economy of the region. William Bent, who was married to a native woman, had a son named George, who will figure in the upcoming Sand Creek drama. A phrase coined during James Polk's administration in 1845 was manifest destiny, the cultural belief that white Americans were divinely ordained to expand their domain and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. By the 1840s, whites had expanded all the way to the Mississippi River and beyond, building settlements wherever they went and pushing the natives farther and farther from their traditional homelands. As the wagon trains snaked ever westward, they were often accompanied by soldiers who built forts near the white settlements and acted as a police force to protect the settlers from the displaced natives. Some tribes naturally resented and resisted this incursion into their homelands and attacked the trespassers. The Indians were usually portrayed as the aggressors when all they were doing was defending their homeland. At times, the two sides got along, especially when it came to trade that was beneficial for both the whites and the natives. But more often than not, the two sides would enter into a treaty only to have the U.S. government unilaterally break it if doing so was beneficial to the white settlers. Here you see a political cartoon showing an Indian agent getting rich off of the money that was supposed to go to support the natives. As years went by, one treaty after another was broken. When gold was discovered in California in the late 1840s, and then what became known as Colorado a decade later, it brought even more Easterners pouring westward and more tensions between the whites and Indians, as they were now collectively called. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 had given the land lying between the Platte and Arkansas rivers and between the Rocky Mountains and the Smoky Hill River to the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in perpetuity. In this case, however, perpetuity ended up being less than a decade. Prospectors illegally entered Cheyenne and Arapaho land in search of gold. Once gold was discovered, over 100,000 other whites invaded and established settlements on land that was home to the indigenous people. The new sweep of immigrants to the Rocky Mountain region during the Colorado Gold Rush of 1858-59 demanded a new treaty, the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise. Fort Wise was renamed Fort Lyon after the Civil War began. In 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wise was made with American Indian tribes in Colorado Territory to restrict their access to their hunting grounds, locate to a reservation, and grow crops in exchange for provisions. There were periods of crop failures, however, and the government did not always honor its agreement to provide those provisions. Tribes began stealing food and livestock to survive. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were restricted to a small triangular reservation in southeast Colorado, a desolate area bounded on the south by the Arkansas River and on the east by Sand Creek. Its only redeeming feature was that it still supported the great bison herds, although most Cheyenne expected that the herds would likely disappear within a generation. In 1861, the U.S. government created the territory of Colorado out of portions of the Utah and Kansas territories. Massive herds of bison roamed the Great Plains, bison that the Plains Indians, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, Pawnee, Lakota, Sioux, and others relied on for food and hides that were turned into tents and blankets and clothing. Although there were millions of square miles in the Great Plains, you can see here that the Cheyenne suffered when they were forced to live and work next to other tribes with whom they were not too friendly. The wide open ranges of the Indians were increasingly taken over by cattle ranchers. Farmers and sheep ranchers came too and fenced off the wide open spaces. There was a serious clash of cultures. As I said, although the U.S. government had signed treaties with the native inhabitants to respect their lands, too often these treaties were broken. The land given or sold to settlers, and the natives forced onto reservations where there was little or no way for the Indians to exist. Although the word extinction was rarely, if ever, uttered in the halls of Congress, that seemed to be the goal of the government. The nomadic Plains Indians continued to have their land confiscated by the settlers, who were at the mercy of Indians who sometimes became hostile towards the intruders. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president and inaugurated in March of 1861, and the Civil War broke out the next month. The northern and southern states began a civil war. Both sides wanted Indian tribes to join their cause, but most tribes remained neutral. To protect the fabulously rich gold fields and silver mines in Colorado from the Confederates, who would soon cross from Texas into New Mexico and up the Rio Grande Valley to threaten the territory, President Lincoln appointed William Gilpin to be the first Colorado territorial governor. Gilpin managed to raise a regiment to save Colorado for the Union. The Texans were turned back after a two-day battle at Glorieta Pass outside of Santa Fe in March of 1862. A little commercial break here. If you've read my book, Distant Bugles, Distant Drums, it gives you a detailed explanation of Colorado's involvement in the Civil War. But Gilpin was ousted as governor by Lincoln when it was discovered that he had used some unauthorized methods to pay for the weapons and wagons and equipment of war that the Colorado troops needed. He was replaced by Dr. John Evans of Illinois. Evans was a distinguished physician, an abolitionist, and a personal friend of Lincoln. He had founded the city of Evanston, north of Chicago, and Northwestern University. He also started a railroad and became wealthy, dropping his medical practice. When he came to Colorado, he would found the Colorado Seminary, which became the University of Denver. In addition to being governor of the Colorado Territory, he was also the territory's superintendent of Indian Affairs. With the West secured, Lincoln turned his attention to the war still raging in the East and spent little time thinking or worrying about the Indians. Despite his many admirable qualities, Lincoln fell short when it came to his relationship with the indigenous peoples. His grandfather was killed by Indians, and he had enlisted to fight in the Black Hawk War of 1832, a fight over tribal lands in Illinois, but he did not see combat. Lincoln signed the Homestead Act and Pacific Railway Act in 1862, thus unilaterally breaking a treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho by taking away their homelands and giving away millions of acres to settlers and railroad companies. Historians have pointed out that Lincoln was a reactionary when it came to Native American issues, making and breaking treaties, confiscating native lands, forcibly removing natives, and turning a blind eye to the genocidal acts by the military on the western frontier. Lincoln signed acts into law that gave away millions of acres of tribal land to support white westward expansion. Historian Christopher Anderson wrote, Lincoln's acceptance of U.S. Indian policy indicated he conformed to the general social attitudes toward Native Americans in his time. He continued to view them as a foreign people that would need to be removed through purchase or conquest. During his time in the White House, he displayed the common paternalistic attitude that Indians needed the white man's civilizing influence. In March of 1863, when hosting Plains Indian dignitaries at the White House, Lincoln told them, "I can see no way in which your race is to become as numerous and prosperous as the white race, except by living as the white race does, by cultivation of the earth." And you can see here in this picture taken at the White House, there's a group of Indians sitting in the foreground here. There were ongoing clashes between whites and the Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians on Colorado's eastern plains during this period of time. The citizens of Denver and other Colorado towns were demanding that the governor do something to protect them. Former Colorado State historian David Hollis said, when it came to Indians, Evans believed that they didn't have souls, that they were heathen savages, that they were infernal. In 1864, Evans issued a proclamation that authorized all citizens of Colorado to go in pursuit of all hostile Indians and kill and destroy all enemies of the country. Evans then turned to a man who had distinguished himself at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico 2 years earlier and was now the commander of Colorado militia troops, and asked him to come up with a solution. The man was John Milton Chivington, a former Methodist minister. Chivington's solution was to kill Indians wherever they were found without determining whether or not they were guilty of the depredations against the settlers on the eastern plains. About this time, an incident occurred that would change history forever. A band of Indians, possibly a group known as Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, attacked a ranch near the present-day town of Elizabeth, about 30 miles from Denver, and murdered and mutilated the wife of Nathan Hungate and their 2 children, set the farm buildings on fire, and stole the cattle. The Hungate bodies were brought into Denver and publicly exhibited in order to arouse fear and anger among the citizenry. Bending to the outcry of the citizens, Governor Evans authorized Colonel Chivington to form a group of Indian fighters to punish the natives. They weren't even real soldiers. They were called a 100-day regiment, men who joined up for a few dollars and the chance to quench a bloodthirsty desire to kill Indians. As a result, rather than diffusing the situation, clashes between Indians and whites became more numerous. Major Ned Wynkoop, the post commander at Fort Lyon on the Arkansas River, was approached by a chief named One Eye and urged to organize a peace council with Evans and Chivington in an effort to ease the tensions. On September 28, 1864, this delegation came under Army escort from the Eastern Plains to meet at Camp Weld in Denver. Several chiefs were part of the group, including White Antelope, One Eye, and Black Kettle, the chief of the Cheyenne. Also present were Major Wynkoop, commander of Fort Lyon, and Captain Silas Sewell, commander of the 100-man Company D, 1st Colorado Cavalry Regiment, stationed at Fort Lyon. Wynkoop had been a company commander during the Civil War at Glorieta Pass under Chivington. Wynkoop and Sewell, too, wanted peace with the Indians. Sewell's family had been friends with abolitionist John Brown, helped Brown at Harper's Ferry, and helped escape slaves on the Underground Railway. Sewell had been a member of the abolitionist militia in Kansas before moving to Colorado. During his tenure as post commander at Fort Lyon, Wynkoop encouraged peace efforts with the Cheyenne. Wynkoop had issued them rations and allowed them to trade with locals in preparation for winter, but he was transferred in November of 1864 to Fort Riley, Kansas, where he was posted just days before the Sand Creek Massacre took place. But peace was not on the minds of Evans and Chivington. After promising the Indians that they would establish on the banks of Sand Creek, its actual name is Big Sandy Creek, about 170 miles southeast of Denver, and fly an American flag and a white flag above their tents, Wynkoop's troops at Fort Lyon, 40 miles away, would protect them and provide rations to them. But it was a ruse. Protecting the encampment was the last thing that Evans and Chivington planned to do. Let me go back here. So Black Kettle and other Cheyenne chiefs gathered non-combative tribal members and moved them towards Fort Lyon. But Wynkoop was between a rock and a hard place. He was trying to serve two masters, Governor Evans and General Samuel Curtis, commander of the Kansas district, under whose jurisdiction Fort Lyon lay. He had sent a telegraph to Chivington at the time of the Camp Weld Conference and said, "I want no peace until the Indians suffer more." In early November 1864, Curtis relieved Wynkoop of his command at Fort Lyon, and after hearing rumors that the major had disobeyed Field Order No. 2, which expressly forbid post commanders from allowing Indians to enter or camp near a military fort, Curtis was apparently unaware of Governor Evans' order directing the Indians to establish a camp near Fort Lyon. Major Scott Anthony he replaced Wynkoop as commander of Fort Logan. And now we have what is Field Order No. 2. It was issued in July of 1864 in response to the Dog Soldiers of the Northern Band of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors and their declaration of war on white settlements in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. The order directed fort commanders to step up protection of both private and military lives and property. The directive also ordered post commanders to forbid all Indians and their allies from approaching forts unless they were intercepted and blindfolded before proceeding. This added measure was intended to prevent Indians from spying and ascertaining troop strength at the forts. And now comes the attack. The Sand Creek encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho consisted of 113 tents or lodges and about 650 men, women, and children, although the numbers vary. Following an earlier order by Major Anthony, the Indians had turned in whatever mules and horses they had stolen from the whites. They also surrendered their weapons to show their peaceful intent. Although they had not yet been authorized to leave Denver, Chivington ordered the ragtag contingent of over 500 Indian fighters to leave Camp Weld and begin a week-long march to Fort Lyon. When he reached Fort Lyon on November 26th, Chivington was greeted by the new post commander, Major Scott Anthony, who had also served under Chivington at Glorietta. There were about 250 soldiers of the Colorado militia stationed at the post, including Silas Sewell's company and a company of New Mexico infantry. Chivington ordered Anthony to prepare his troops to ride under cover of darkness to the camp on Sand Creek, along with his own band of 100-day Indian fighters, where they would wipe out the camp. On the night of November 28th, the Chivington force, numbering roughly 650 to 750 men and towing 4 artillery pieces behind them, left Fort Lyon and made the 40-mile march to the sleeping encampment. Positioning his men on the south and west sides of the sleeping camp at dawn, Chivington ordered his men to attack. The camp's inhabitants were, of course, taken completely by surprise. Not all of the Indians' firearms had been turned in, and so a few of the Indians began firing back at the soldiers. Many also had bows and arrows. They were outgunned, of course, and Army bullets and cannonballs began tearing through the camp, followed by men on horseback shooting Indians at point-blank range and setting lodges and tents on fire. Chief Black Kettle flew the American flag and a white flag on a pole in front of his lodge, but they did no good. Here's an Indian drawing showing one of the soldiers shooting and killing an Indian at the flagpole. George Bent, the half-breed son of William Bent of Bent's Fort, was living in the encampment with his Cheyenne wife, Magpie. He had fought on the Confederate side early in the Civil War, was taken prisoner, and then returned to Colorado after he was released. This is a map of the Sand Creek attack drawn by George Bent. He also wrote an eyewitness account of the attack. He said, "Bullets flew thick at all of us, men, women, and children. We ran. It was like running through fire. We reached the sand pits dug against the banks. This is what saved a good many men, women, and children." Bent went on to say, "That night I managed to walk 10 miles to a ravine and fell exhausted. It was very dark and cold, and those that were not wounded, kept up the grass fires, as there was not wood or blankets to keep the wounded from freezing. Of course, no one slept. Wounds began to pain. George Bent survived the attack, but died 54 years later during the great 1918 influenza epidemic. White Antelope shouted at the soldiers, "Stop, stop," and held up his arms. As the firing intensified, according to Cheyenne and Arapaho stories, he folded his arms and calmly began to chant his death song, "Nothing lives long except the earth and the mountains." Shot through with bullets, he died in the creek bed. Scenes of horror followed. Men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, these 100-day volunteers, dismounted and began butchering the dead and dying Indians, scalping them, cutting off ears and other body parts as trophies. A sense of decorum prohibits me from describing some of the atrocities that they committed. As hundreds of Indians fled north up Sand Creek, soldiers on horseback charged after them and shot them down. Cannons were brought in to slaughter those taking shelter along the creek bed. But throughout the attack, Silas Sewell and his 100 men of Company D sat on their horses atop a nearby hill, observing and refusing to participate in the slaughter. Sewell realized that he and his men would probably be court-martialed, but he didn't care. His moral principles would not allow him to take part in such a terrible act. Another officer, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, also observed without taking part or allowing his men to. The attack lasted from dawn until 10 or 11 a.m. When the smoke cleared, 230 to 250 Indians lay dead. About 400 managed to escape. One Eye and Left Hand and White Antelope and other chiefs were among the dead. Shivington's losses were 7 men killed and 45 wounded. Chief Black Kettle managed to escape the slaughter, but would be killed almost exactly 4 years later at Custer's attack at the Washita River in Oklahoma. Many of the soldiers at Sand Creek scalped the Indians. The gruesome trophies were brought back to Denver and displayed in downtown businesses and in people's homes. Many of the citizens cheered Shivington and his so-called soldiers for having at last solved the Indian problem. The Rocky Mountain News reported, "Cheyenne scalps are getting as thick here now as toads in Egypt," and a Denver area theater displayed the grisly trophies on stage. Rumor has it that 2 of the Indian children who survived were brought back to Denver by the soldiers and raised by white families. After the massacre was over, both Silas Sewell and Joseph Kramer returned to Fort Lyon and wrote letters to Major Wynkoop at Fort Riley, detailing the barbarity they had witnessed. This started an investigation by the Army of the massacre. And now we go to the aftermath. John Shivington had hoped to run for Congress and assumed that his attack on the Indian encampment, hailed at the time as a great victory over hostile forces that endangered Denver and other eastern Colorado towns, would propel him into high office. But it did not turn out that way. In 1865, a congressional investigation was formed, and the report described Shivington's actions in the vilest terms possible. One officer testified, "Chief Left Hand stood with his arms folded, saying that he would not fight the white men as they were his friends. I told Colonel Shivington of the position in which the officer stood from Major Wynkoop's pledges to the Indians and also Major Anthony's, and that it would be murder in every sense of the word if he attacked those Indians." The officer added, bringing his fist down close to my face, "Shivington told me, 'Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians.' I told him what pledges were given the Indians. He replied, 'I've come to kill Indians and believe it to be honorable to kill Indians under any and all circumstances. I want no prisoners.'" To quote a portion of the Congressional Committee's findings, upon observing the approach of the soldiers, Black Kettle, the head chief, ran up to the top of his lodge, an American flag, as he had been advised to do in case he met with any troops on the prairies. And then the scene of murder and barbarity began. Men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered. Not content with killing women and children who were incapable of offering any resistance, the soldiers indulged in acts of barbarity of the most revolting character. Such, it is hoped, as never before disgraced the acts of men claiming to be civilized. It is difficult to believe that beings in the form of men and disgracing the uniform of United States soldiers and officers could commit or countenance the commission of such acts as cruelty and barbarity as are detailed in the testimony, but which your committee will not specify in their report. As to Colonel Shivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe his conduct. He deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of his cruelty. The truth is that he surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe they were under the protection of the United States authorities, and then returned to Denver and boasted of these brave deeds he and the other men under his command had performed. As a result of his testimony against Shivington, Silas Sewell was gunned down on the streets of Denver in April of 1865, probably by Shivington's supporters. And according to this plaque, marking the place of his death at 15th and Arapahoe Streets, his murderers were never brought to justice. Neither was anyone else connected with the Sand Creek Massacre. Here's Sewell's grave in Denver's Riverside Cemetery. It's usually decorated with flowers. Instead of ending the troubles with the Indians, the Sand Creek Massacre actually inflamed them and brought about several more decades of warfare. There's a partial listing of some of the major battles with various tribes in the ensuing years. You can see here, second from last, or the last line, Custer and his defeat at the Little Bighorn, and it continued on until 1891. Kind of hard to believe. After the Sand Creek Massacre, the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers went looking for revenge. They burned white settlements, attacked wagon trains, and temporarily cut off trading routes to and from Denver. In January of 1865, an Indian army of 1,000 warriors made a successful attack on Julesburg, a prominent way station on the Overland Trail in northeast Colorado, in which they killed many of the outnumbered townspeople and soldiers. Afterward, many of the Cheyenne went north to join Lakota Chief Red Cloud on the Powder River in Wyoming. Before leaving the area, they burned many South Platte River Valley homesteads. George Bent took part in this raid. Because of his role in the Sand Creek Massacre, John Evans was removed from office in August of 1865 by President Andrew Johnson. He died in 1897. John Shivington was never court-martialed because he had resigned from the Army in 1865 before the congressional investigation began. He bounced around for many years, moving from Colorado to Nebraska and marrying his daughter-in-law. She divorced him in 1871. He then moved to Omaha, then to New York, into Canada, California, and Ohio. Finally returning to Denver, he worked briefly as a deputy sheriff before dying of cancer in 1894. He's buried at Fairmount Cemetery, and his grave is regularly vandalized. He remained unrepentant and insisted that what he had done at Sand Creek was the right thing to do. But what's there now to see? How many of you have been to the site at Sand Creek? Wow, about at least half of you. Great. In 2000, President Bill Clinton created the 1,500-acre Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site to mark the site of the atrocity. Here the wind blows across the plains, perhaps echoing the sighs of the men, women, and children who died here 159 years ago. A brochure from the National Park Service says, since the barbarism of November 29th, the Sand Creek Massacre maintains its status as one of the most emotionally charged and controversial events in American history, a tragedy reflective of its time and place. The Sand Creek Massacre lay in a whirlwind of events and issues exacerbated by the ongoing Civil War. Critically, the Sand Creek Massacre stands as a testament to a brutality that should be learned from and never repeated. A lesson of what the rejection of conscience in the face of fear and hysteria can lead to, and the suffering that this betrayal has imparted on generations of Arapaho and Cheyenne people. Despite the government's best or worst efforts, the Native Americans were not wiped out. Today, there are approximately 326 Indian land areas in the U.S. administered as federal Indian reservations, that is, reservations, pueblos, rancherias, missions, villages, communities, etc. The largest is the 16 million acre Navajo National Reservation located near the Four Corners area in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. But life is hard in many of these desolate locations. Many Native Americans live below the poverty level and suffer from depression, alcoholism, and other substance abuse addictions. But many are also trying to preserve their tribal traditions. If you've ever attended the amazing powwow in March in Denver, how many people have been to the powwow? 3 or 4. You've seen the tribes come together to dance, chant, beat their drums, and march across the Denver Coliseum floor in a spectacular procession. Did you know that there is a Native American History Month? Anybody know that? No, most people don't. Guess what month it's in? November, the same month as the Sand Creek Massacre took place. Also today, there are some 5 million Native Americans, 78% of them living outside of a reservation. Deb Holland, a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe, is the Secretary of the Interior, the first Native American to hold a cabinet position. But I think of Native Americans as the invisible people. When's the last time you saw anyone who looked Native American in a print ad or in a TV commercial? The last one I remember, and maybe the only one, is Iron Eyes Cody, the so-called crying Indian in the Keep America Beautiful TV ads in 1971. But Iron Eyes Cody is actually 100% Sicilian, not American Indian. His real name was Espero di Corti. Slowly, very slowly, the terrible transgressions of the past are being rectified to a certain extent. For example, I'm sure you've all heard that Mount Evans was just renamed Mount Blue Sky. In Longmont, in 2005, Shivington Drive was renamed Sunrise Drive. But the almost ghost town of Shivington in Kiowa County still exists, just 9 miles from the scene of the massacre. A note of hopefulness to end. Every year in November, a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho youth make a 170-mile relay run from Sand Creek to Denver to commemorate the tragedy of Sand Creek. So in closing, I just want to say, may we never forget the tragedy, and that we continue to be the trespassers, invaders, and occupiers of someone else's homeland. Thank you very much for your attention today. If I have not written a book about this subject. There are books out there. One that I would recommend, however, is called Cheyenne Summer, and the subtitle is The Battle of Beecher Island, A History. Beecher Island was a scene of a battle in eastern Colorado, and although I would say only about 20% of the book pertains to that battle, it gives you wonderful buildup to why the whites and the Indians had such a hard time meshing their cultures. So I would highly recommend that.
If you have a question, speak up loudly.
Yeah.
Get it recorded.
If anybody has a question. Yes, sir.
Just a comment. Do you know about the M. Naughton Supreme Court case in 1823?
The M. Naughton Supreme Court case in 1823.
Yes.
I'm afraid I don't.
That case, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the entire continent, or what is the United States, was they had a war with the Brits. We won, and we are the sovereign, and that Native Americans can't sell real estate that they've occupied, and that they are just occupants that can only hold and be on the land as long as they are peaceful and don't cause any trouble. And that was a U.S. Supreme Court case, and I read it, and I never really thought about how it would integrate with this. That was law in 1823.
And that was 4 years or 40 years before the Civil War began.
That's correct.
And 20-some years before the westward migration, the Manifest Destiny.
I mean, I don't know if they had any legal underpinnings of what they did, but that case is interesting.
Yeah. And there wasn't much settlement west of the Mississippi at that time either.
They were basically taking the whole continent and saying, we beat the Brits, we are now the sovereign power, and everything here is ours.
Wow.
So
very interesting. Had not been aware of that. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a case where some Indians tried to sell land to white people, and they got blocked.
Wow. I'm sure the Indians didn't get the memo on the Supreme Court decision. Wow. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
You may have said something at the beginning, but can you describe how it is you came to devote this much time, energy, passion to this topic?
Well, when I was doing research for my book on Colorado and the Civil War, I discovered, a lot of information about that. And when I approached the publisher to include a chapter about that, they said, no, the book's getting a little long. You can mention it, but you can't devote a whole chapter to it. So I kind of put it away in the back of my head. And then my wife, before we were married, worked for 2 years with Public Health Service on the Navajo and Hopi reservations in the Four Corners area. So she has very strong feelings about the Indians and how they are currently forced to live and bad things that were done to them. And I think it wasn't until I went to see the exhibit at History Colorado, it opened a year ago, that the impact really hit me. And I said, I've got to do a presentation on this. And thankfully, Mike said, yeah, you can do it here. And this is the second time I've actually done this presentation. I did it once for a Daughters of the Union chapter meeting a few months back. Yes, ma'am.
How long is that display section on Sand Creek going to be?
I went on the History Colorado website yesterday to see if there was an end date to it, and I did not see one. So you probably have to call History Colorado, and if you're interested in seeing it, get down there before they take it down. I know, in fact, I don't know if it's in the same spot, but next month in November, History Colorado is going to do a major exhibit on the 10th Mountain Division, which is my primary area of focus because my dad was in the 10th Mountain Division, and the museum's educator, Dave Little, he knows more about the 10th Mountain Division than I do, and I've written two books on the subject. So my guess is it'll be coming down the end of this month. So if you want to get to see it, do so quickly. Yes, sir.
You went through a long list of battles that came after Sand Creek,
Mm-hmm.
and I went by too quickly. I was wondering about Summit Springs
Yes.
and how that played into the aftermath of Sand Creek.
Yeah, it was all tied in with the Indians' anger at being deceived into thinking that they were going to be protected by the Colorado militia, only to discover that it wasn't. And I think any thought on the parts of the tribes that they were going to be able to get along with the whites went out the window at that point.
Tall Bull was killed there, right?
What?
Tall Bull?
Tall Bull at Summit Springs. I'm not familiar with the details, but you seem to know that.
Well, I think he was the leader of the raids on Julesburg and some of the others
Okay.
in eastern Colorado.
Okay.
But there is a monument out there too.
Okay. All right,
People
so,
get through.
yeah. Well, we have monuments to, atrocities all over our state, and many of them are hidden away, and you stumble on them by accident. And so keep your eyes peeled when you're driving around Colorado. Bear?
Flint, on piggybacking on this idea, would you back the slides up to the first list of all those battles? So
Let me
we can take
go.
a longer look at it,
Okay, let's quickly get there.
and then eventually show the second slide. By the way, great photographs.
Oh, thank you. I enjoy looking for the graphics that tell the story. We've got Sand Creek here in November of '64, Julesburg, January '65, massacre at Sterling, Colorado, January '65, Godfrey Ranch, Marino, Colorado. I don't know where Marino is.
Just this side of Sterling.
Just the side of Sterling.
Highway 34.
Okay.
It's how big a town is, just off
But
76.
it's just a little small town named for all the sheep that they had out there, Merino sheep.
Oh, okay, okay. We got Mud Springs, Nebraska in February '65. Whoops.
All of those occurred during the Civil War.
Yeah, right.
And just a few months of Sand Creek.
Yeah. Rush Creek in Nebraska in February '65. Platte River Bridge and Red Buttes in Casper, Wyoming of July of '65. That was right after the end of the Civil War. War against the Comanches, 67 to 75.
Where was that?
All over. It
All
was
over.
very widespread.
Okay.
Yeah. The Beecher Island battle that I talked about is in that book. The Washita River in Oklahoma in '68.
That's in Northern California by Mount Shasta.
The Modocs.
The Modocs, those
Mhm.
are the Modoc Indians.
Right.
And there was lava formations up there because it's a volcano. And they chased them into those, there's been a long time.
Yeah. And I think this is where
Chased them down.
Colonel Canby, who was in charge of the New Mexico troops during the Battle of Glorieta Pass and helped the Colorado troops out, was killed by one of the Modoc chiefs during that time. He'd gone there to try and make peace. The Little Bighorn campaign in '76 and '77, Custer's defeat in the early part of that campaign, war against...
Would you run it back one? I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, never mind.
Okay. The Nez Perce War, 1877.
That was up in Washington and northern Idaho.
Uh-huh. The Bannocks, I'm not sure where that took place. In Idaho?
No, not the Bannock.
Okay. The Cheyenne, kind of an ongoing thing. Oops, and the Sioux also lasted quite some time from '86 to '91, and it's repeated down here. Against the Apaches and the Wounded Knee battle in 1890.
Why do you list the war with the Sioux twice?
Oh, that was a typo.
I'm sorry?
It was a typo.
Oh,
I didn't mean to put it both places.
Just a correction, Wounded Knee was in South Dakota.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I have North Dakota here.
So
You've seen one Dakota, you've seen them all, right?
Trouble with that.
I'm from South Dakota, I live not too far from.
All right, thank you for that correction. I'll make sure I change that. Mike?
This probably doesn't also reflect many other smaller incidents.
Right,
Because it was a Meeker massacre,
right.
and my wife's great-grandfather was part of the infantry unit sent out for that.
That's right. Yeah.
And the after.
Yeah. Well, I'll be doing some revisions on this. So,
But those look like major kind of
Yeah.
campaigns.
yeah. Yes.
Is there any explanation for perhaps why we don't see anything south of the Mason-Dixon?
About why, what?
We don't see the type of atrocities south of the Mason-Dixon. father.
Yeah, Jackson moved them all out on the Trail of Tears.
1820s and 30s.
Yeah.
So after the Trail of Tears, there was no more.
Well, like the Cherokees were originally in the southeast part of the country, and they were moved to Oklahoma, or what became Oklahoma. It was originally known as the Indian Territory. But yeah, most of the tribes had been relocated by the time of the Civil War. Bear?
I believe one of Grant's staff officers was an American Indian, and he was present at the signing of Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. And he
Okay.
appears in one of the famous paintings.
Okay, I'll have to look for that. I think a footnote here, kind of a sad footnote, is the fact that after the West was settled, but before the battles against the tribes, against the whites out here in Colorado and Wyoming and Utah and some other spots, that after the Civil War, there were a lot of freed black slaves who joined the U.S. Army. And they were sent out here. I think it's the 10th Cavalry Regiment and the 9th, I think, were the two black regiments that were sent out west to fight against the Indians. So you have one oppressed group fighting another oppressed group. And I find that somewhat ironic.
They were known as the Buffalo.
The Buffalo Soldiers, right?
Because of their hair.
The Indians thought that the hair, the nappy hair of the black soldiers reminded them of the black nappy fur of the buffalo shoulders that they had. So, yes, sir.
I was going to mention, I had the opportunity or work experience on the Oglala Sioux Reservation back in the late 60s. And really interesting people I ran into. One man his name was Leonard Littlefinger. Leonard was a survivor of the Wounded Knee Massacre. Of course, he was just an infant or a couple of years old at the time. But both his parents were killed there. And of course, he had lots of stories. And those stories were amplified by Edgar Red Cloud, nephew of the great chief.
We saw his picture there, yeah.
Right, and Edgar looked very much like him. And I was working with setting up a community college there at the time. And so I talked to Edgar about coming over to talk with a group of Native American students. And he said, you know, my memory is not so good. Sometimes I don't remember very well. And I said, well, that's okay. Leonard, we'll prompt you or whatever, and there'll be questions. He said, well, you don't really understand. He said, I might be helped a little bit. I have a friend whose name is Jake Herman. And Jake could come over and talk too, because he seems to remember what I don't remember. And I suddenly realized what he was looking for. I was giving him a stipend to speak, and he wanted a stipend for Jake also. And so the two of them came. Jake was the tribal historian, and he had gone to Carlisle Institute.
Right, in
And
Pennsylvania.
He was a classmate and longtime friend of Jim Thorpe. But he was not an athlete himself, but he was a student there. So he had a lot of stories to share about Carlisle and the days on the reservation.
Wow.
He gave me a booklet that he had written, and of course I turned it over to History Colorado many years ago.
Wow, great story. Thank you.
It was an interesting time to live there, where not all the old ways had been extinguished. There was lots of tradition.
Sure,
still there.
sure. Yeah. Excellent, thank you. And thank you all for, we have one more question back here.
One more question. My understanding that the Sand Creek Massacre site is a designated national Civil War site.
It's a National Historic Site.
National Historic Site. Is there any movement that you know to make any of these other
I would say, I think that some of the areas like Julesburg, and Dave, you could maybe back me up, might have a small museum, a historic museum about the town, and they would include information on that. But if it's something out in the middle of nowhere, there might be a marker, and that would be about all, you would be able to find, which I think is a great shame. I think we need to memorialize these historic sites, even if they are painful to our white ears these days.
Or no matter how small or large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it affected many people, and many people died, and we need to remember that. Again, thank you so much for your attendance today. Thank you.